Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So this is a pretty important week for us because we really begin researching now. Technically, we sort of started last week, but last week was more about selecting topics and just sort of learning the basics about the GBC library databases and just sort of acquiring some basic research strategies. So hopefully you guys saw all the stuff that I posted last week in the week 4 module. So as promised, I posted the recording of my live 102 class receiving library instruction last week from the GBC librarian. So I know the video is a little difficult to hear at first. There were some audio issues in the first couple of minutes, but those got cleared up and the librarian was able to do his usual presentation, and that's available for you. If you don't want to sit through the class recording, I also linked you to the library tutorials. So if you go inside the week 4 overview, you should see a link to some of the tutorials, and on the main module page underneath the recording of my live class, you'll see a link to a document, or it's just a PDF that will give you more information about how to log in to the library. Because I know some of us might have issues, or perhaps we've experienced issues with our username or password. So that file there that I posted called Login Help should help you to kind of walk through all that stuff and get your login issues resolved. If you're still having issues, as I mentioned last week, you might want to call the technology help desk and get some assistance directly from them. They are, of course, available. You can call them. They're there for students and faculty. So make sure you can get access to the library databases because you have to use them at least sometimes as we continue to research. So today I want to give you some information that will allow you to get ready for the annotated bibliography. The first half of the annotated bibliography will be due at the end of this week. So I want to give you sort of an overview of what that assignment is and how you need to approach it. But I also just want to talk a little bit about research in general, and I want to talk about some of the types of sources that I really want you guys to use. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about topic exploration now that we have chosen topics. So if you haven't made a final decision about your research topic and you're watching this video early in week 5, you really can't wait much longer. You need to settle into a topic and you need to start researching, because obviously I want to see at least 4 of your sources by the end of this week. You can always sub some of those sources out for new and improved or new and better sources that you might find later on, but I need to see that everybody is researching this week. And in order for the work that you do this week to help you later on down the line, you really need to stick with the same research topic. If you end up changing 2 or 3 weeks from now, that might be okay, but you will have wasted a lot of the work that we're doing, well, right now. So let's make this work pay off by sticking with our topics. And again, as we learn more and more about our topics, we might sort of get rid of some of the early sources that we found and replace them with better sources. That's okay. That's a natural part of the research process. But it would be great if some of at least a couple of the sources that you found this week could end up helping you later in the semester when we actually start working on our research papers. So remember, keep that focus on argumentative topics, right? We need to choose topics that will allow us to eventually make arguments about them. Don't forget that our research papers are going to be argumentative. So as you're selecting topics, just ask yourself the simple question, can I make an argument about this topic? And if the answer is no, don't pursue it. I cannot stress that enough. A lot of students are surprised around week 10 or week 11 when they realize that they actually have to make an original argument about their topic. They have to take a side. They have to establish a position on the topic. And a lot of people are like, oh, I didn't know. I didn't think that I would ever have to do that. So just keep in mind that you will have to do that. So ultimately, when you're choosing topics, you must choose topics that lend themselves to debate. Now, you don't have to have your argument worked out yet. You don't have to know exactly what you're going to say about your topic, but you need to know that there are arguments being made on multiple sides of this particular issue or this particular topic, and then you know that eventually you can pick a side, or you can carve out your own original position that you might not think other people really have taken. But at some point, you're going to need to do that kind of work. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so hopefully you've already started looking around at the library databases. Maybe you've done some Google searches. So maybe we've already found a few sources. That's great. If not, you really need to start looking this week. And I want to talk a little bit now about the types of sources that we want in English 102. The acceptable sources that we can use eventually on our research papers. So these are the types of sources that I want to see on your bibliographies. So I'm just going to run through the major categories and sort of give you just a really quick rundown. This information can be found in the Week 5 overview. So I'm not going to repeat everything that I've already written. I just want to emphasize a few key points. So let's start with books and ebooks. And as I say in the overview, I get it. A lot of students are reluctant to use books, especially now that we're all sort of isolated and we can't actually go to the GBC library and check out books. Not that many people did that even in the old days. But we're also reluctant to use books because we often don't think that we have time to read an entire book. And that's probably true, but I just want to remind you that you don't have to use an entire book in order to use that book as a source. So I always recommend that you guys take a look at abstracts and tables of contents when you are checking out a potential source online. And if you find stuff using the GBC databases, as the librarian pointed out last week, you will be able to read an abstract, which is just a summary, a brief summary of the source. And then oftentimes you will also be able to see the table of content. So you might have this big scholarly book that's very long and very detailed, and you don't have time to read the whole thing, but you might be able to find a specific chapter, a specific section or part of the book that is valuable, and you might just end up using that one particular chapter, and that's fine. You don't have to use the entire book. One chapter might be all you need. So sometimes it's that's the way it ends up going when we're using books. Remember that a lot of books are available electronically. So just because we can't physically go to the GBC library right now does not mean that we can't use books as sources. You can always find ebooks, and you can find ebooks through the library databases. So just keep that in mind. But generally, the types of sources we normally use for these projects will be what we call periodicals. And periodicals basically refer to articles found in newspapers, magazines, and academic journals. So these are three different types of articles, but they're all good. They are all valid. They are all acceptable sources to use in 102. So let's start with newspapers. They are usually short. They are normally easy to read. I know a lot of us don't really read newspapers anymore, but over the course of your research, you are going to come across newspaper articles, and you can use those. Students often like newspaper articles because they are short and they are relatively easy to read. And I don't have a problem with newspaper articles, but I do not want you to use nothing but newspaper articles. You can't rely exclusively on newspaper articles because sometimes they don't quite provide the depth and the detail that we want. So they're fine, and a lot of them will work well, but you have to eventually kind of move beyond newspaper articles. You can certainly use a handful, maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, but that's probably all we want from the newspaper world. But you're going to be able to find these in a lot of different kinds of searches. If you go onto the library databases, you will be able to search for newspaper articles. But you can also visit newspapers' websites. Most papers are online now. So most newspapers, whether they be local or national, have websites that you can visit, and you can read those articles online, often for free. Obviously, don't buy a subscription to any newspaper. We don't want to do that. But if you can find articles for free just through a Google search, that's okay, but you can also find them through the library databases. And the good thing about using the databases, one of the many good things about using the databases, is that you know that everything you find can be accessed for free. That is not a guarantee when you're just looking on Google. Okay, so newspaper articles are fine. Also, magazine articles. Now, I'm talking about news magazines like Newsweek, like Time. I'm not talking about People magazine, no gossip magazines. We don't really want, stuff that primarily focuses on entertainment or celebrities or whatever. We want news magazines that often have a national circulation. And again, they often have websites. So like The Atlantic is a well-known news magazine. It's been around forever. It's online. And if you guys remember that Storm Area 51 article that we read back at the beginning of the semester, I'm pretty sure that came from The Atlantic, if I recall. So magazines like that are fine because they feature news stories. But unlike newspaper articles, a lot of magazine articles are going to be a little bit more in-depth. They're going to be a little bit longer. There might be just more information, more detail. So again, those are fine. I don't want you to rely exclusively on magazine articles, but newspapers and magazines are fine. They are acceptable sources, and we can certainly use them. But the best kind of periodical, the best kind of article that you can use will be an academic journal article. So let me just say a few words about academic journals. These are typically what we call peer-reviewed. And that's very important for us as we are trying to find reliable information. So peer-reviewed means for example, if I were to submit an article to an academic journal that specializes in English or literature, if I submitted an article to one of those journals, it would be reviewed by other English professors, other scholars and experts in the field would look at my work. They would basically vet it, they would read it and make sure that it was accurate and good and worthy of publication. And they would probably tell me to make a few changes, a few revisions, a few edits. I would make it a little bit better, and then eventually it would get published. So this process matters for us because newspaper articles and magazine articles don't go through that. They're not peer-reviewed. They are edited and they are reviewed by some kind of editorial staff, but we can just rely on journal articles a little bit more because they've been reviewed and approved by other experts in the field. So that's just another level, just makes it kind of a higher level of reliability. Also, academic journal articles tend to be written by professors, doctors, scientists, and experts in their respective fields, which again matters to us because these are people that we expect to know a lot about whatever subject area they're exploring because they work in that area. They have done research in that area. They teach in that area. So we look at them as authorities. Now, of course, nobody's perfect. Even authorities, even experts can make mistakes, but we can typically rely on their work. Now, as you guys know, newspaper and magazine articles are typically written by journalists. Now, we can trust a lot of journalists. Most of them are doing good work, but they might not necessarily be experts in the subject area that they are exploring. But that's okay, right? Because a lot of journalists will interview people who might be experts. They will talk to people who might be experts, but they themselves are not necessarily experts. Another thing that makes academic journal articles a little bit better is the fact that authors in those articles have to cite their work. So this might strike a chord with us because the authors of academic journal articles are bound by the same citation rules that you guys as students are bound to. So they have to cite their work. They have to provide in-text citations just like we will, and they have to provide a works cited page just like we eventually will. So again, that's just another level of reliability because they're citing their work, they're getting reviewed by experts. So not only does that make us feel more confident about the information in those articles, but also we can use their sources as potential sources of our own. If we see good sources cited in academic journal articles, if we see other articles, other books listed on that works cited page, we might want to go and search for those sources as well. We might be able to find them and use them ourselves. So again, academic journal articles are at the top of the heap, and then, magazine articles are next. Newspaper articles are a little bit lower down, but they're still acceptable. One more thing, though, that I will say about academic journal articles is they tend to be longer, as you can imagine. They tend to be a little bit more complex. They tend to be more detailed. They're more jam-packed with information, which can make it a little bit difficult to get through the articles. So if you guys remember back in week 3, those sample articles that I posted for that week's research journal, the first 3 all came from newspapers or magazines. They were all pretty easy to read. They were written for a general audience. But the 4th and final article that I posted, the one about wildfires, that was an academic journal article published in a scientific journal, written by scientists. So you might have noticed that that article was longer, it was denser, it was definitely more difficult to read. Because again, remember, academic journal articles are not really targeted to a general audience. They are targeted to a specialized audience consisting of advanced students and academics or scientists, doctors, depending on the field. But that particular article that we saw in week 3, it was really directed at other scientists, people who teach science, and advanced students who might be pursuing science in school. So it's a more narrow audience, a more specialized, highly educated audience. So that means it's going to be a more difficult read. You're just going to have to deal with that because eventually you're going to have to use at least some academic journal articles. And in part 1 of the bibliography, which is due at the end of this week, I want to see at least one article from either an academic journal or a scholarly book that was published by, again, an expert, a professor, a scientist. You need at least one academic source for round 1 of the bibliography. And then when we complete the finished bibliography later in the semester, you're going to have to, show me multiple academic sources. But for right now, just one on part 1 of the bibliography. So keep that in mind and be sure to read the directions that I've already posted for the annotated bib part 1. So if you have any questions about periodicals, just let me know. But you can usually tell that you're dealing with an academic journal based on the title. A lot of times the title will give it away. So if you see a title like the Clinical Social Work Journal, or the Journal of the American Medical Association, or the Harvard Law Review, or, these kinds of titles will indicate that you are dealing with an academic journal. Wildlife Biology, American Literary History, that's a real journal that I've worked with before. Those are academic journals. They have titles that are kind of specific, and they don't necessarily look or sound like something that you could just go to Barnes and Noble and buy, like a Newsweek. You can find news magazines pretty much anywhere. You can find newspapers anywhere. So just be aware of the differences between these different kinds of periodicals: newspapers, magazines, and academic journals. Okay, so let me just talk briefly about websites, because I know a lot of us will be using websites, even though they're not as good. They are not as good when it comes to sources as books or periodicals, but they're easy, right? We can always find stuff on websites. I get it. I can't stop you from using websites, but I will just give you a few words of caution, okay? So not all websites are created equal. Some are better than others when it comes to research. So I want you guys to look and pay close attention to the types of web addresses that you're looking at. So if we're talking about websites that end in edu, that's okay. Those are generally going to be websites created and maintained by colleges and universities. So the edu is short for education. And if the website was created by some kind of educational institution, we can usually trust the information that we find there. All right, so .edus are okay. .govs, govs, those are also okay. Those are sites created and maintained by official government agencies. Now, I get it. We don't always trust what the government tells us. I know. And we might not always trust what schools tell us. But just in terms of research, we can generally trust .edus and .govs. Most government agencies are not super political. At least they're not supposed to be. They're typically just sort of giving us, unbiased information, and there's not usually much of a political angle on that stuff, although some people would claim that that's now beginning to change. But for now, we'll still accept .gov stuff. There's usually good information there, a lot of information, a lot of numbers. You'll find a lot of statistics and hard data, oftentimes numerical data, on government websites. And then finally, if you're looking at .orgs, ORGs, those are typically going to be nonprofit organizations. And again, those are kind of hit or miss, but we can usually rely on the information we find on .orgs, because these are organizations that are not primarily geared towards making a profit. They are nonprofits. And a lot of nonprofits are engaged in sort of like humanitarian work, helping the homeless, providing services to underserved populations. So we can typically trust their work. But when it comes to .coms, we have to be skeptical, because you guys probably know com is short for commercial, which means these are sites that are generally aimed at making money. These are for-profit businesses that are usually trying to sell us things. So you can often tell that you're on a .com site because you'll see advertisements, and you don't typically see ads on those other types of sites that I've already mentioned. So the one exception to my no .com rule is if you're looking at, say, theatlantic.com or the wallstreetjournal.com, because a lot of newspapers and magazines, as I've already said, have websites where you can read their issues online, sometimes for free. So that's fine. You can use sites like that, and in some cases, that's the easiest way to get your hands on newspaper or magazine articles, because a lot of them are no longer published in hard copy form, or at least you probably don't have a subscription, so you're not going to get one of those in your mailbox. You can buy them at bookstores and stuff, but a lot of times in the modern age, the easiest way to maybe grab an article from The Atlantic is just to go to their website. But again, a lot of those websites will ask you to subscribe to their paper or their magazine before you can read anything. Don't spend any money on research. We can do all of our research for free. So again, this is why the library databases are better than just a typical Google search. Because a typical Google search might take you to theatlantic.com, but then you might have to pay for a subscription. But if you go through the library databases, you'll be able to find potentially articles from The Atlantic, and you'll be able to grab the PDF or an HTML file without having to pay for anything. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, websites are okay, and sometimes you'll actually find good articles or good information on websites. Stuff that's written by experts or people who work in the field. Sometimes you'll even see condensed versions of full-length academic articles that appeared in journals. You might see versions of those also appearing on educational websites, on certain EDUs. So that's okay. And like I said, certain articles published by government agencies or just information provided on government agency websites, those can be good. So those types of sources are acceptable, but you have to be careful with websites. Not all websites are going to be good. And you need to avoid stuff like answers.com. You need to avoid personal blogs or websites. And you need to avoid social media. That's kind of obvious. But I will just say a quick word about Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia cannot serve as one of your sources. You cannot use a Wikipedia page as one of your sources. However, I'm actually a pretty big fan of Wikipedia. I think it's a good resource. But I always tell students, Wikipedia is not where your research ends, it's where your research begins. So at this early stage, as you're learning more about your topics, you can go on to Wikipedia and just read a little bit about your topic. You can just kind of educate yourself, and I want to talk a little bit more about that today. This is an idea called topic exploration, and we have to do it shortly after choosing our topics. We need to just learn a little bit about our topics, especially if we're not already super familiar with the topic that we have selected. Even if you are familiar, though, you still need to read up on it. You need to maybe look up a few key terms and definitions. Definitions are good. Write down what a few key terms mean. You also might want to educate yourself a little bit on the history behind the topic. What's been going on over the last few decades in relation to your topic? What are people saying about it? Have there been any new or recent developments pertaining to your topic? Have things changed about your topic in the last few years or the last decade? You need to know that stuff. That might not not all of that's going to show up necessarily in your research papers, but you just need to know. Remember, we were talking about ethos a few weeks ago. We were talking about your credibility as the writer, as the arguer. You have to have credibility, and that credibility is based on knowledge and goodwill. So we're not worried about goodwill just yet, but we are working on our knowledge. You are learning more about your topic so you can enhance your knowledge. You're eventually going to show off some of that knowledge, and that's going to help you to build your credibility. So while you're doing that kind of work, Wikipedia is really useful. So I recommend checking out the Wikipedia page, if there is one, on your topic and read through it. There's probably going to be a lot of good information. So the example that Eric was using during library day last week was, global warming or climate change, whatever. Let's just say that's your topic. It might not be, but just for the sake of an example, you can type that into Google, climate change, global warming, or both, and you're going to get a lot of, hits. You're going to get a lot of search results. But one of those results will be a Wikipedia page. I know because I was looking at it yesterday with my live class. If you go and look at that Wikipedia page, there's going to be a lot of good stuff there. And the best part about good Wikipedia pages is the fact that there will be a reference section near the bottom of the page, essentially the works cited page for that Wikipedia page. And you're going to see a lot of good stuff there. And you might even find links to other websites. You might find links to PDFs and actual files, articles, and books that whoever made that Wikipedia page used while making the page. So the reason we can't use Wikipedia as an actual source, as you guys probably know, is because it's an open topic resource, an open source resource, which means that anybody can post information there. Anybody can edit information there. So that makes it a little bit unreliable. But in my experience, academic pages, pages created by scientists or professors or doctors, stuff pertaining to academic topics, tend to be more accurate than the pages that are written about like a celebrity or some, sports star, because fans will go on there and change stuff. And a lot of that information changes and might not be accurate. But people tend to be a little less interested in doing that when it comes to more dry academic topics. So people are going to go on to like Tom Hanks's page and make stuff up, or some other famous actor. I don't know why I chose Tom Hanks, who most of you might not know who that is. But, that doesn't happen as much, although it can happen. It doesn't happen as much with, scientific topics or topics pertaining to education or engineering or the kinds of things that we are writing about. But again, we're not going to use those pages as sources. So we're not super concerned if maybe a few of the things are a little bit off or outdated. But again, a lot of those pages are worth reading. Even if not everything there is great, there's still going to be some good info. And the most important thing is that you might be able to access some of the references that the maker of the page used. Like I said, scroll down to the bottom and look at references. Sometimes it's even called works cited, but a lot of times they'll just use the term references. So look for links, look for PDFs. Some of those links might be broken because things change over time, but take a look. It's not a bad way to spend 10 or 15 minutes at this early stage. Skim the Wikipedia page and see if you can check out a few of those links or a few of the PDFs that are included under references, and you might be able to use some of that stuff as your own sources. So that's worthwhile. And also, I just want to briefly mention Google Scholar. So we all know how to do a Google search, but if you go to Google and do a search for Google Scholar, you'll get the exact same basic setup. It's just like Google. You can type in your search terms, but Google Scholar will only give you results from academic sources. Those academic journal articles that I was just talking about, and books published by experts and scholars. So it functions just like Google, but it gives you a more narrow field. It gives you a more narrow set of search results, which will help. And again, you'll be able to get access to a lot of those sources that show up in your search. So you'll be able to find links to websites. You'll also be able to find PDFs. You'll be able to find actual files, and you might end up being able to use some of that stuff. And if you look over some of it and decide, yeah, I want this particular article, you'll be able to go ahead and download that PDF or save it, and you'll have it for later. So this is a good way to get started on our research. check out Wikipedia, do a search in Google Scholar, and just start gathering some information. Even if you're not finding a ton of actual sources at this early stage, you can still learn more about your topic. And that's always a good thing. And then between the reference section on a good Wikipedia page and Google Scholar, I bet you'll be able to find at least one or two potential sources. But of course, those are not substitutions for the GBC library databases. They're just other things that you can do, other strategies that you can use to help get started. So I'm going to stop part 1 here. I'm going to come back for a shorter part 2 where we talk a little bit more about the databases and the annotated bibliography. So please tune back in for part 2. It will be brief, I promise.